Welcome. My name is Paul Gronke, and we'd like to welcome our viewers to another in our series of talks titled Resilient Elections. Resilient Elections will focus on research and administrative reforms that can help to improve and ensure a safe, secure, and accessible election in 2020 and beyond. Our intention is to highlight new, cutting-edge, and policy-relevant research that speak to emerging problems in election administration and reform rising out of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're hoping to demonstrate the value and lay out successful pathways to academic and administrative partnerships that can help identify solutions for election administration. My collaborator in this effort is Michael Alvarez. Michael Alvarez is a professor of political science at Caltech and the co-director of the Caltech MIT Voting Information Project. My name is Paul Gronke, and I'm the director of the Early Voting Information Center at Reed College. So Michael, I'm handing it off to you to introduce today's guest.
Thanks, Paul. And I have to say, we're really excited today to be talking with Justin Levitt. Justin is a professor of law at Loyola Law School here in Los Angeles, just literally right across town from Caltech, where he's also the associate dean for research. Justin's career has been really interesting so far. And I say so far because obviously we're all still quite young, and he's done work in both academics and government, and that's part of the reason why we wanted to chat with him in this as part of this series. He's also done an interesting stint at the Department of Justice, where he focused on voting rights and protections against employment discrimination. And in particular, his work on voting rights and election protection has appeared both in a variety of academic outlets and policy outlets. And I'll say, just from my perspective, and I know from Paul's perspective as well, Justin's work has been really important for research and teaching purposes for both of us. In fact, I just earlier this week was looking at some of Justin's work on election fraud, and it was really important for some work that we're currently doing. So Justin, welcome. We're really glad to have you today.
Thank you so very much. I am delighted. As you both know, I'm an enormous fan of both of yours. And so I think it's an extraordinary series you're putting together here. And so thank you so much for allowing me to play along.
Well, thanks. It's a lot of fun. Now, one of the things I know you've been doing this cycle is that you've been tracking election-related litigation here in the U.S. And, from my perspective, I'm not an election lawyer, but from my perspective, given the number of emails and calls I'm getting from election lawyers, there seems to be a dramatic increase in the last couple of years in election-related lawsuits. Is that the case, and why are we seeing this dramatic increase if that's what's really happening?
So I think we're definitely seeing a dramatic increase in cases filed in March and April and May. I don't know if by the time we get to November, we'll just have seen a time shift rather than a numerical shift. But there's lots more litigation right now than we've normally seen in past election cycles. And part of that, I think, is because we are working our way through a once-in-a-century pandemic. And it turns out that our election structures are flexible in a lot of ways and very inflexible in some others. A lot of the conditions and rules and regulations that were built for normal conditions, normal environmental conditions, aren't really built for the ways in which we'll have to modify processes to vote in a pandemic. Now, legislatures and executives have been responsive to some of that, and they've changed some rules on the fly, but they haven't been able to change others, or they haven't been willing to change others. Some of the rules are in statute and can be, but haven't been overwritten, and some of them are locked in state constitutions and can't be adjusted. And when that happens, people turn to the courts. And I think it is unsurprising that we've seen with the onset of unprecedented stay-at-home orders for an election structure that usually relies in a lot of states on lots of people gathering together in physical locations. I think we've seen people take to the courts to ask to move some flexibility into a structure that's not really designed for it. And at the same time, when executives and legislatures have taken some of those steps to make things more flexible, we've seen attempts to use the courts to shut that down, to say that the steps that are being taken aren't warranted. So I think both of that combines for an awful lot of litigation now. I'll say the fact that we're getting it in February and March and April and May and June and July is better than getting it in August and September and October. We may be seeing resolution of some litigation now that would normally run right up until the eve of election day itself. And the fact that we're getting at least some of this out of the way early, I'm sure is a great relief, not only to voters, but to election administrators that have to deal with the outcome.
So Justin, I have a quick follow-up. It's interesting the way you characterize the legal landscape right now. So many of us have been reading the work of your friend and colleague, Rick Hazen, who has warned a decade ago, really, of the voting wars, a term we all use a lot, that the litigation has become sort of part of the election strategy. It sounds to me like something different is going on this year, that litigation, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but litigation is in some ways the most efficient strategy or efficient path to resolution. I know I've been working with a number of states and other groups to try to get states that do not allow absentee ballots to be processed prior to election day to try to change those rules and regulations if they can because of the inevitable flood that they will be receiving. So do you agree with that characterization that perhaps the litigation this year is not a sign? I mean, voting wars is still going on, but there's also a sign of litigation perhaps being the best way that we can resolve some of these under this crisis situation.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I think that's absolutely right. I think that you've got the normal or the new normal of election litigation strife and pursuit of advantage that's running sort of underneath, and then a rather thick layer of attempts to respond to unprecedented circumstances. And sometimes the courts may be, if not the best option, the least bad option for getting some of those procedures in place in ways that administrators can actually respond to. There are some executives and legislatures that have moved very quickly, and some others that have not. And you're right, the conditions that you need to run an election effectively when you've got a historic 2 or 3 or 4% vote by mail rate are not the conditions that you need to run an election effectively when you've got a 50 or 60 or 70% vote by mail rate. I mean, we see Kentucky as a great example in this respect. Went from a historic rate of voting by mail around 1 to 2%. And at least at last approximation, I know we're still figuring out exactly how much, about 80% vote by mail in the June primary. That's a seismic shift, and the existing election structures aren't great at dealing with that seismic shift. So litigation over the deadlines for casting absentee ballots or the extent to which you can process absentee ballots before election day are really adjustments to the process that will help us run an election unlike any other election we've run in the last 100 years.
So how do you think that this increase in litigation, especially, you know, at this period of time when our election administrators throughout the country are also dealing with pandemic planning and running elections in this context, do you think that this litigation is really having a negative impact on their ability to, you know, better administer elections? Is it generating undue uncertainty? Is it influencing their workflow though in negative ways?
Yes. Whether those negative ways are undue or not depends on the lawsuit. So some lawsuits I think are really good, are in this pandemic situation necessary. And there's no question litigation interferes with election administrators' ability to carry out existing plans. There's no question. They have to pay attention to it. They have to respond to the actual course of litigation. And if a court decides they have to do something different, they have to actually do that different thing. On the other hand, the status quo may not always be serving election administrators well in an election that is decidedly not status quo. And so sometimes that change, sometimes that forced change actually ends up welcome. Whether the interference is, you know, net at the end of the day worth it, I think depends very much on the individual lawsuit. There are some bad lawsuits out there that will fail that are purely distraction in the meantime. There are some lawsuits out there that are just about marginal changes, and I question the extent to which those lawsuits actually interfere enough to make the marginal change not worth it. And then there are some lawsuits out there that I think are desperately important in order to help us run a smooth election and a fair election this November. And those might well be worth it, I think are worth it despite the disruption they may cause. There's no question they cause disruption, but some of those costs are worth it at the end.
Yeah, absolutely, Justin. One of the issues that I've been following and have been engaging with a number of reporters and some election officials is on the excuses for absentee voting. Not surprising, that's one of the areas I work in. And I've tried to convey that if you're a local, at least the ones that I speak to, they don't want to be making, say, health-related decisions. They're not positioned for that. They would rather have guidance from the state to tell them what these conditions are. We don't want local election administrators asking for notes from the doctor. And I literally mean that. How are you supposed to say that I have this health-related concern? So let's turn to your kind of dual role here, both as an academic, litigator, and policy work. You know, you've moved between these worlds fairly smoothly. So what would you say, somewhat smoothly? We all have little bumps in the road. We just drive around them. So what would you say from your governmental work in Department of Justice? How would you say that has informed some of your academic work now at the law school, both teaching and on the research side?
It's been tremendously informative. I think practice and I think uniquely academics in the election field tend to dabble or more than dabble in practice. I've noticed legal academics and political scientists are firmly engaged in real world electoral activity. And I don't want to say certainly more than some other fields, and maybe more than most, at least in the world of legal scholars. I notice a lot more commitment to being at least partially in practice among my academic colleagues. And I think that absolutely feeds teaching and scholarship back in the classroom. It always helps to have the real world facts on the ground basis to both project what's wrong with the theory that exists and also to figure out how to implement the theory that exists and the right scholarship that actually responds to the real world rather than just existing in a vacuum. The thing I noticed most, and this was not a surprise, but you feel it differently when you're in it, about my time in government, is how starkly different the government role is from what most people think it is in the election world. So the Federal Department of Justice has a civil rights division, and people think of that as the entity that's responsible for enforcing civil rights. And that means that when there's an election problem, people look to the Department of Justice to fix it. It turns out, and this is not a surprise, but it's not muscle memory, even for people who work in the field, that the federal government only has the authority to enforce a select set of statutes, and that the capacity to enforce those statutes is a lot smaller than fixing the vast range of problems out there. I actually had more tools in my toolkit working in the real world when I was working on campaigns doing voter protection work, where you can organize, where you can apply political pressure, where you have state statutes at your disposal in addition to federal statutes, where there are boots on the ground in different ways than the federal government has. The Federal Government Civil Rights Division enforces a few statutes that respond to the election process. And there are a lot more things outside of that scope than there are within that scope. I liken it in some ways to an aircraft carrier. It's awfully powerful when it gets up and rolling, but it takes a while to get up and rolling, and it generally only points in a few directions. And there's an awful lot of ocean out there that the aircraft carriers aren't able to patrol or aren't authorized to patrol. And that's something that, like I said, it's not news to you both, certainly it's not news to people in the field, but it becomes instinctual to rely on an organization to fix things that it doesn't have capacity to fix. And that speaks a lot more to the work that all of the other entities and organizations do in the electoral process outside of the federal government.
Well, so to follow up slightly on this in a different way, you know, we're in this really, I think, amazing moment. A lot of our students also want to be engaged, in addition to the faculty in law schools and in universities, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, because of the upcoming November election. There's just so much going on in our world, and I think all of our students and our colleagues really do want to be involved and engaged in new and important and meaningful ways. How are your law students experiencing this moment? I mean, you're also, you know, located downtown. I assume most of your law students are, you know, probably live in Los Angeles. What are you advising them about getting involved and being more engaged at this point in time?
I think for better, it's impossible not to be engaged at this point in time. In fact, the decision not to be engaged is an active decision not to be engaged. The moment is here, and law students are very much a part of it, whether they want to be or not, and most of them emphatically want to be. So you're absolutely right. Loyola students are incredibly diverse. They come from all over. Many of them live downtown, and in the immediate aftermath of the semester, obviously, the protests arrived just at the end of the school semester for us. And students were worrying about completing a law review competition or worrying about doing the first week of their summer jobs while there were explosions of fireworks and tear gas canisters and sirens and marching in the street right outside, literally right outside the apartments where they were living. So the moment is here. I look at that catalyst to action as a very good thing. We have systemic problems. We have had systemic problems for a very long time. They do not fall equally on the population. And in this moment of electoral tumult and social tumult, having an avenue to not only acknowledge, but help people respond to that systemic inequity is really helpful. It's helpful to name it in some ways, and it's helpful to focus energy. A lot of people want to get involved, not just passively, but actively. And I credit a lot of the movement for doing that, for raising that energy and focusing it. The interesting thing from an electoral perspective, it's done several things. It's done a wonderful service in pointing out, again, what most of us in this field know really well, and that is presidential elections matter a lot, but they're not the only item on the ballot, particularly in elected prosecutors' offices across the country. Those offices can be immensely important for delivering or forestalling criminal justice. And I think there's been a lot of new focus that the Black Lives Matter movement has put on the offices of elected prosecutors, not just this year, but over the last several years, and with increasing frequency as the protests came to the fore. You know, LA County is one of the largest jurisdictions, as you all know, in the world, certainly in the country. It would be the 10th biggest state if it were a state. And that means that the elected prosecutors of LA County have an enormous impact on the way that millions of citizens perceive and experience criminal justice. That's not always the most prominent office on the ballot, but students are very engaged not only with presidential races and Senate races and congressional races, but with local offices too. And I think that is an immensely good thing. One of the other things, just briefly, that the movement has brought to the fore is the need to stay focused beyond discrete events. The Black Lives Matter movement has been around for years. It is not new. And it uses individual events as catalysts, but lingers beyond them. The whole point of the movement has been to push not just for reactive responsive change, but for proactive change in the moment. And I think there's a big lesson that our students can learn out of the election there as well. We have to stay as engaged with systemic reform in the electoral context on November 4th as we happen to be on November 2nd. And in January, when the new Congress takes over, there needs to be that sustained push to help the electoral system respond. The current pandemic does not affect all voters equally either. And some of the systemic inequalities that we see in the criminal justice protests, or that the criminal justice protests are responding to, are also present. Underrepresented minorities bear the brunt of a lot of the systemic inequalities in the electoral system. And those inequalities and inequities can be addressed in the short term before November, but we really need sustained movement pressure to make sure that we don't forget about them the moment that we have a winner. And P.S., that moment's not going to come November 4th. It probably won't come November 4th. But it's really important whenever we decide who's won, that we not leave the problems with the election system aside. And I think the BLM movement has done a great service to students in really pointing that out.
Yeah, I've had many conversations, as I'm sure everyone has. And what I've said to anyone really younger than me, and I think everyone on this call might fit into this category, I'm sort of right at that age point in my late 50s where I sort of remember the 60s. I was young, I was living in the Chicago area. But what I've said to my kids and my students is, look, this is the biggest social movement in my lifetime, and certainly in your lifetime. And I was mentioned our reporter, Jay Lee, who works with me at EVIC, noted we had the first competitive county district attorney election in the Portland metro area in decades, in part. And we're having serious conversations here in Oregon, I know in California as well, many about zoning and about some of these seemingly minor issues that people have traditionally not cared about, but how those are linked to police behavior, to segregation, and systemic racism. That's a great example, Justin, very moving. Thank you for that. And I know we're going to be having this conversation beyond November. So listen, I do want to talk and close us really with November. We've been closing all of our discussions this way. So what I know, nothing wakes you up at night. I'm sure you sleep soundly every night, but if something were to wake you up at night about November, what's your top one or two concerns? What are you looking at? Where are you paying attention? And so yeah, what keeps you awake at night, or what do you think about in the morning?
Boy, to narrow them down to one or two is really a service, because that puts everything else off the table. Look, this is an unprecedented time in so very many ways. And I worry anytime we stress test all of our institutions at once. Sitting in Portland, you obviously know there are many different ways for unexpected, unusual circumstances, including circumstances at the moment, to manifest themselves. And the unpredictable is now standard. There are many ways in which our elections are resilient, yes, and I think of them a little bit like a water balloon. You can move and the water balloon shifts, and you can press and the water balloon shifts, but you press too much on all of it and it breaks. And then the water's lying on the ground, and that's very difficult to pick up or to repair. And we're in a situation at the moment where there's an awful lot of pressure there, and a lot of actors working to make sure that as much as the water balloon moves or shifts, it doesn't break. I think there is some calculation on the part of some political actors to see if they can push even harder, and that worries me an awful lot about November. I worry about the capacity of jurisdictions to scale up from a few thousand absentee ballots to a few 100,000 absentee ballots on the ground, and statewide, a few million absentee ballots. That worries me. It worries me that people will worry about that capacity and flood the in-person system in a way that's simply inequipped to handle the volume, as we saw in Milwaukee. And it worries me that the public is not yet conditioned to be patient. If anything, we've become more impatient in recent years. And this election is going to require some patience on election day, before election day, and particularly after election day. It will take a while to get the results in really close states due to the flood of absentee ballot. Your work, Paul, you were talking about before, trying to get states to start counting earlier is tremendously important. But even when that happens, it's going to take a minute. And that means, in my mind, that the system is working, not that it's broken. But people are so conditioned to see the election countdown on TV and think that the minute the buzzer goes off and the polls close, that they'll know an answer, that I worry that people will think the election's broken when it's not. And that sort of confidence in administrator work on the ground, in just head down focus, doing the job that we ask them, getting a fair tally, we have to let that happen. Now, I'm a civil rights lawyer, so combined with all of the dark points are at heart, beyond the cynicism and beyond the wide eyes open at the moment, is a pretty boundless optimism that we can actually do it. That's why civil rights lawyers do what they do. And I think the biggest antidote to any of those worries are the election administrators who are actively working on the ground to make sure that all of those things I just mentioned don't happen. And the communication that we're all doing to let the public know that they can and should actually trust administrators on the ground, the county level and town level folks that are working to make sure that the count is fair and that the count does work on time, and are being tremendously creative, because they have to be, in responding to these unprecedented circumstances. I mentioned Kentucky before. Kentucky, I think, is so far a mild success story in that they had one polling place open for all of Louisville, but they moved enough people into the absentee structure, and they chose their polling place wisely enough. They chose the convention center with the capacity to serve thousands upon thousands of people, that they made what might well have been the best of a very bad situation. That's creativity. That's not the normal polling place for Louisville. And there were plenty of people that didn't serve optimally. But in seeking a way to get us through, I said in normal times, I'm looking for enough duct tape to cover the holes in the bucket. This year, I'm looking for enough to make a bucket out of duct tape. And in that world, the election administrators on the ground are trying to make as many buckets as they can out of an awful lot of duct tape. And I think the more that we're able to convey how hard they're working and how hard people are working in the process here to help them, the more the American public can have confidence that they're doing their job and filter out some of the noise around.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like closing, on that optimistic note. I agree with you that I think that our election officials throughout the country, the ones that we work closely with, are really struggling, but really being creative and working hard to try to develop the resilient systems that are going to be necessary to work in this environment this fall. And again, that part of what we're trying to do with this series of resilient elections is to highlight people like yourself, and people like Paul and I, who are engaged in that work you're talking about every day. Trying to help election officials, trying to learn from election officials, and trying to communicate back, to the public and our colleagues about the work that they're doing. So, we could go on for hours. I think this has been a great conversation, Justin. I really wanted to thank you for taking the time to chat with us, and and on behalf of Paul and I, and Paul's team at EVIC, and our group down here with the Voting Technology Project. Again, thanks for your time.
Well, thank you both for all the vital work you're doing.